Welcome everybody to our second Myeloma Crowd Roundtable of 2021. This is our 15th webcast since the start of the pandemic. Now today's presentation, we get this question a lot. It will be recorded and then shared on the myelomacrowd.org website after final production. As we come to the conclusion of Black History Month, we thought it would be really informative to learn about why understanding myeloma in the African American community matters to every patient and caregiver. Now, disparities in myeloma can't be ignored, not just for the sake of fairness and equity, but also because of a growing consensus among myeloma experts that fixing the causes of disparities will be key to achieving cures for all myeloma types, because the genetics of the disease truly matter. Now, for those of you who have participated in past roundtables, today's format will be a bit different. Rather than having individual talks, we'll engage our panel in a wide range of discussion. And we are honored to have such an amazing faculty today. Let me introduce them briefly. Dr. Michael Bauer is a bioinformatics expert at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences in Little Rock. He'll explain why something few patients know about really matters so much to making progress in myeloma research. Dr. Brandon Blue is a myeloma specialist from the Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida, and is a rising star in the field. We're privileged to have Dr. Nicole Gormley, who heads the division responsible for drug approvals in various hematological malignancies, including myeloma, at the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Her responsibilities and work have an impact on literally every myeloma patient. Dr. Catherine Marinac is a cancer epidemiology expert and the co-leader of the PROMISE study, which we'll learn more about today at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. Dr. Gareth Morgan chairs the myeloma program at New York University's Perlmutter Cancer Center. He's pioneered many innovations in myeloma research and treatment, is a genomics expert, and we're honored that he's one of the Myeloma Crowd's scientific advisors. Dr. Pritesh Patel is a myeloma specialist from the University of Illinois at Chicago, whose insights and experience in treating African Americans with myeloma is among the most extensive in the country. Now, to learn more about our speakers, short biographies of the faculty together with our agenda were sent to you by email from our roundtable program director, Greg Brozite, and who will be jointly asking questions with me today. And we thank Greg for his efforts in putting together such outstanding programs like today's. So now, if you have questions to submit, please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We'll do a series of questions individually with the doctors, and we'll leave time for Q&A for you at the end. I want to thank our generous sponsors, Amgen Oncology, Adaptive Biotechnologies, Bristol Myers Squibb, Genentech, GlaxoSmithKline, Janssen Oncology, Karyopharm Therapeutics, Oncopeptides, and Takeda Oncology, because without them, we could not provide this valuable, informative program for patients throughout the world. So let's get started. Let's begin with the baseline. We know that incident rates, and I'll invite everybody to turn on their microphones and their cameras, because this will be a group discussion. We know that incidence rates of Blacks with myeloma are significantly higher than for whites, Latinos, and other populations. We find this for not all other cancers, but a variety of cancers, and we've known this for the past 50 years. So Dr. Blue, according to the most recent NCI SEER statistics, the average incident rate of myeloma in the general population is 8.8 per 100,000 among males, and 5.7 per 100,000 among females. So those rates are slightly lower in whites, but they are 16.5 and 12 per 100,000 in Black males and females, respectively. So can you explain to our audience what these numbers mean and how we should interpret them? For example, like, who do these 100,000 numbers represent? Do these rates also apply to MGUS and smoldering myeloma?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. The problem with that is that myeloma and really those numbers show that it's a rare condition. All right. So that's why a lot of people are frustrated that the doctors haven't gotten their diagnosis right, or that, people are thinking that there's something else going on. Because really, if someone's presenting with an issue, myeloma is typically not number one on anybody's most likely list. Okay. So to put that in perspective, so the average football field. Well, I know we have some people internationally. American football field or stadium holds about 100,000 people. So if you take a stadium of people like the Super Bowl that just happened, and really only about 10 of those people in the whole Super Bowl, considering that, we weren't social distancing and that it's, kind of jam packed, 10 of those folks would have myeloma. All right. So it's such a rare condition that really people, need to be doing education and things like this to kind of make sure that not only they educate themselves, but sometimes they have to actually educate the doctors because it's such a rare condition. And things like smoldering myeloma and MGUS are a little bit more common. So, but they're still not common. So to put it in perspective, so MGUS has about 100 people at the Super Bowl as opposed to 10. So while it's 10 times more common than the actual active disease itself, you couldn't tell me that you couldn't pick out if I said 100 people at the Super Bowl had green shirts. There's no way you would be able to pick out those people at such a big event or to really to put it in perspective. So really, and also, it's a disease of aging, really. And so we know that the older and older people get, the less and less sometimes people go to the doctor, or the more and more complex their really medical care is, and they have all these what they call comorbidities or really other issues that's going on. And so if someone finds something that might be what they consider to be precancerous, they might not even kind of bring it to the forefront of that patient's attention because, unfortunately, by age 80, they have diabetes or high blood pressure or something else that might be causing them a little bit more problems later in life. So while it is out there, we're all here on this call today to really let people know and raise awareness, but it's definitely not a common thing. So as far as education, we got to do the best that we can. So I appreciate you guys for putting this on, and hopefully we'll have a good hour of learning more about these diseases.
And it's like the zebra, and with the age, like you mentioned, even though I think the African American population is diagnosed at a younger age than typically white, so like it's hard. You have back pain and you have fatigue, and who doesn't have that, at an older age? I mean, those are really common things. Anybody else want to comment on really incidence topics?
Yeah, I guess I'll add to kind of, Dr. Blue touched on the complexity or the challenges in kind of understanding the true incidence of MGUS and smoldering myeloma, these precursor conditions, because they're diagnosed incidentally. So we have an idea of the incidence or the prevalence of MGUS, the precursor condition in the population, from studies that have taken blood samples from a large portion of the population to see how many people have a myeloma protein in their blood. And in general, the data tell us that about 3% of all individuals over the age of 50 seem to have a myeloma protein or low level of the protein in the blood. What's challenging about smoldering myeloma is that, these incidence rates that you're talking about, these 8 to 10 per 100,000, come from cancer registries. And another complicated layer is that when we code cancer cases in cancer registries, smoldering myeloma patients are often counted the same as myeloma patients. So understanding kind of the true prevalence, so how many people in the US today have smoldering myeloma, or the incidence, how many people are diagnosed with smoldering myeloma each year, is really hard to know with any precision.
Yeah, I honestly couldn't agree with you more. I can't count the number of patients that I had that actually came up with the diagnosis because they got in a car accident and actually went to the emergency room for something else. Or one of my favorite stories, I had a patient who was putting up Christmas lights, fell putting off Christmas lights, was like, hey, let me just go to the ER and get checked. And then I had to give him some unfortunate news, So really, a lot of times the symptoms and the problems are things that are so vague, as Jennifer was saying. I feel tired, I have some pain in my back, or that really no one knows kind of really what's going on. And so hopefully we can just educate the masses on this condition.
There are some important features, I think, around. It's important to know that most myeloma goes through a pre-malignant phase. And is it the difference between African Americans and Caucasians due to an increase in the pre-malignant phase, or is it the same rate of the pre-malignant phase that just turns to the clinical phase more frequently? And the studies that have been done up to now focus on an increase in the pre-malignant phase where there's no symptoms, no signs. And so really, if you want to understand this, you have to find some way of getting an insight into those pre-malignant phases and what's different between African Americans and Europeans in the context of, is it their immune system? And I think there's a great theory around that African Americans may have better immune systems that were more suited to when you were in an environment in Africa, and then you move to the US in what is now a sterile environment where your immune system doesn't get conditioned, and then suddenly your immune system is kind of too efficient, and as a consequence, you get more of these pre-malignant phases of disease. And that's a well-trodden theory called the hygiene hypothesis that was first developed for children with pediatric ALL.
Interesting.
Okay. Well, let us move to the next question. Of the many innovations in cancer treatment in the past 15 years, one has been the birth of bioinformatics and its integration into research. Dr. Bauer, can you explain in lay terms what bioinformatics is, how it assists research, and how it factors into treatment decisions, and if and how it factors into treatment decisions? And based on your experience, how can bioinformatics help in addressing racial disparities and myeloma research in general?
Yeah, so bioinformatics is kind of, if you ask 5 bioinformaticians, they might have 5 different definitions, but kind of what I like to say, it's like the intersection of computer science and biology. And it kind of came about around the same time that the whole genome was sequenced for the first time, about 15 to 20 years ago. And when we did that, we had so much data that you couldn't just put it on a laptop and look at it. You needed servers, and you needed people that were able to manage that data and then to process it, to have the algorithms to be able to look at all this data all at one time. So over the years we got the high throughput sequencing where we can look at the whole genomes of lots of people very quickly. We can look at their gene expression at the same time. And now we can even do single cell. We're looking at individual cells and the cells around the cancer to see how they're talking with each other. So it's just, you really need the processing power to be able to combine all these pieces of information to get like a more holistic view. And I even think in terms of diversity and stuff is like starting to include stuff of where a patient's from, what their microbiome is. So the bacteria that are in us and on us and how that may affecting treatment based on, that could be a racial thing or social economic thing. So bringing all those things together takes a lot of processing power, and that's where bioinformatics kind of comes in and maybe be able to help tease out some of these things that we're talking about between the races, and kind of all together that kind of will help everyone. Because if you're looking at a minority population but see same disease, but maybe it's being affected differently. So all the way that genes interact with each other, they are called pathways, and the drugs that we use are really to knock down a gene or that pathway so that the cell dies or whatever. But if you're seeing that it's happening in different ways, but the same thing, maybe you can adjust that treatment for another population that way as well. So that's kind of my broad take on how bioinformatics can help.
Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
So Mike brings up a great point that I think he kind of did it subtly, talking about the microbiome and genetics. And what we're all talking about is nothing's completely about your genes. That's kind of completely for sure. It's the interaction between you and your environment, and both are dependent on the other. So when people are good for one environment, may not be quite so good in another. And so the microbiome is a way of us getting some clear insights to kind of tease out whether it's socioeconomic differences, sort of differences in weight, or differences in diet. And so you need lots of processing power, one to do the sequencing, but then you need lots of processing power to understand the microbiome. And that's where the bioinformaticians fit in. And Mike and I have worked together for quite a while now, and he does a great job.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, really the marriage between computers and technology and medicine is something that's really should have been happening a long time ago. And so I'm happy to see people that have interest in that. But especially with a condition like myeloma, it's so rare. The only way we're going to know kind of what's happening with all the different people across the world is really to make sure that we kind of all have groups like this where people are actually able to kind of talk internationally and kind of figure out, because honestly, the first question that people ask when they sit down in my chair across from me is, why did I get this? How did this happen? I've never been sick in my life. Like what's going on? I've never had a cold before. Now you're telling me I have cancer. And really to figure out some of those questions to why, we need data, right? And the only way that we're going to get data is to get a large amount of people. We can't do that if technology doesn't bring us together. So that's really one of the major things. I'll tell a quick story. There was a city, I'll leave the city unknown, but basically what happened is that these kids were developing asthma at a large rate. And so all these kids were coming into the clinics and they were giving them like inhalers and treatment for the asthma. Come to find out through technology, we actually were able to locate that all these kids were coming from a very specific zip code. Not only that, the kids were coming from a very specific project housing community. So they were able to basically put these interventions in that basically kind of tore down this old dilapidated place that had, a lot of issues, but it was giving kids asthma. But they didn't as the doctors coming in, not every time are we checking someone's address. All right, this person's from here, patient number 2. No, that's just not something that we did. And luckily it took really technology being able to kind of put the pieces of the puzzle together for us to kind of make those type of realizations. And so, just as it did it for pediatric asthma, I imagine, for myeloma will be next on the list.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Gormley, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I think just one other aspect of this that I think, we're sort of touching on, and I just might frame slightly differently, is just also, I think, to underscore the importance of having diversity in these databases that are looking at various samples. Oftentimes, there may be reticence in certain minority communities, in particular African-American community, to participate in research and even, genetic research as well. But I think it's really important because, as we're able then, as Dr. Blue and Bauer already pointed out, learn from these data sets, and they can, contribute to the health of the community. But I think it really is important that there is diversity in these databases that we're collecting.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And I think I've noticed, and when you look at data sets, typically the traditional data sets that are available are like EHR data, insurance kind of data. They're not really complete data sets. So I just want to echo what you all are saying about the need for additional data sets like the microbiome or the social history or everything else together. And that's been one of our intents with this HealthTree product, is to invite patients to participate so we can share and learn together, and it's open to all. So we can see some of these subpopulations and see what are the concerns, what's different. Are we seeing geographic, things? Is it family history related? And I know the PROMISE study is trying to do some of that too.
It's the age-old question, Jennifer, is it nature or nurture?
Uh-huh, right.
So I would have follow up on Brandon's point, because it's only with things like HealthTree that reaches out across the country that you can ever get enough of kind of that diversity. And Nicole's correct. The more diversity you have in your genetic studies or any studies, the more information you have to dissect the problem out. So it's a really positive thing to go after diversity in clinical trials and in cancer registries.
But also, I think to include the patient in the process. I think sometimes in clinical research, we don't invite the patient as much as they should be invited to participate. I mean, some of the studies, of course, they have to participate in clinical research to get, Dr. Gormley's helping products get out the door, and approved because patients participated. But in terms of sharing your myeloma story and some of your myeloma data, I think is kind of a new concept that can be help accelerate research. Yeah. Well, any other comments before we move on to the next question? Well, Dr. Patel, you almost exclusively treat minority patients from Central Chicago. So can you explain some of your patient experiences about diagnosis, treatment, access to the latest medications and procedures? And then how are their experiences different as compared to like patients who have access to good insurance or transportation technology?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I think this is a hugely important question, and it's one that I feel very passionately about. So I can tell you, I think it's worth looking at this question in two parts, because we have a ton of data out there in our literature to say, to show the differences between the experience. So we know that Black patients in large epi studies on the whole do worse. And when you look into the granularity of that, you see that actually there are several single center studies that show that if you have equal access to care, you either as a group do equally well or better. So really here in the difference between these two types of studies, we're talking about issues of access. And we know that, for example, in things like transplantation, that's used at a much, much lower rate in minority patients. We also know that the time to get to transplantation is much lower in minority patients. We also know that simple things like access to particular classes of drugs is lower in minority patients. So we see across the board that there's inequality in the literature that's out there. So obviously these are large homogeneous groups, large heterogeneous groups that people have treated it all together. So we put racial groups together in epi studies. So I can tell you what I hear from my patients on a daily basis. And obviously this is not representative of, hey, this is what everyone of a particular race goes through at all, but it's what I hear in inner city Chicago. And I will tell you on a daily basis, we get stories of things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, lack of access to good information on myeloma, lack of access to the internet, lack of access to transportation. So it's really humbling when you hear stories of patients and how hard it is to go through any cancer diagnosis, but then you add this additional layer. I can't even fathom sometimes the hardship that people go through. So when I tell you this, if you group this together, I think at the very least, you have to say that that's really unfair. And at the worst, you say that we really have a social and racial injustice that we're perpetrating. So clearly the experience is very different for some patients as opposed to others.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments?
So I just wanted to add on to that and just say, you know, as part of the Healthy People 2020, they came out with what they call the social determinants of health. All right. And basically based off of that, they determined these several factors that basically determined how people's health would be. All right. And unfortunately, in those determinants, they found that really minority people really kind of do worse than across the board. So, you know, while myeloma is one of those areas that we know that is a problem, unfortunately, it's also the case for breast cancer. It's also the case for colon cancer. It's also the case for job security. It's also the case for financial literacy, you know? So it's one of those things that I think the picture or the answer to the question is probably bigger than myeloma. You know, it's one of those things that unfortunately we have a systematic issue that's happening. And so whether that be, you know, like I said, healthcare, education, jobs, we really got to kind of work better as a system to kind of make sure that we help people because it's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I think so to tag that as absolutely the issue, right? This is a system-wide issue. To tag team onto that, I think if you're talking about myeloma or any other cancer, I think that if we continue to publish more studies on, hey, if it's bad to be from this minority where you're marginalized, it's bad not to have money. So we don't need to do that. We've documented this a lot. This is a problem that we don't need to document. This is a problem that we need to do something about rather than, hey, look, we know that things are worse. We've done that for the last 10 years, 20 years. We need to move on from that and try and fix this.
Any other comments from the panel?
Dr. Bauer, I just would want to add to that and maybe ask a question of you. How do you think bioinformatics could be helpful, or even Dr. Marinak with epidemiology, how could this be helpful to address the concerns that are raised by Drs. Patel and Blue?
Yeah, that's a hard question, I guess.
That's why I gave it to you.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Patel said it nicely. You know, as an epidemiologist, what we do a lot is measure these disparities, and I think his point is well taken that these are very well documented. And so you know, we don't need more evidence to show that there's disparities in healthcare resource utilization, disparities in access to care and access to timely care. But you know, kind of it's time to stop measuring and making sure we can do what we can to kind of equalize access.
Mm-hmm.
Well, also too, it's a whole science behind that. It's called implementation science. So one of the things that we do, unfortunately, is we like to report the problem, but really there's a science behind, like, actually doing a project, seeing if that works, and then scaling it, right? And so those are the things that I think that we're missing out on, to say, hey, this is the problem. I have some idea, your idea, my idea, somebody come up with an idea and try it. It could work. If it doesn't work, scratch that. Plan number B, scratch that, plan C, and I think if we did that on a larger scale, or really emphasize some of those, especially in some of these conditions like myeloma, if you help 100 myeloma patients, that's major, and so, I think with a rare cancer, something like that, you can really make a meaningful impact, even though you don't have the, the large numbers, like something like a breast cancer or something like that. So I think that's one of the key issues too.
Mm-hmm.
You have something that's rare, and kind of what Mike has been doing is you try to saturate them with information. So if you can't have hundreds and thousands of people studied at a low level, you get a smaller group and you look in high depths. And so where bioinformatics fits in is it allows that, like, kind of huge data sets on individual patients. So the microbiome is a huge data set. The patient's history is a big data set. Their genome is a big data set. And then as we go forward, you can descend into that pit where you look at epigenetics, you look at protein variation. And then the skill of the bioinformatician is to develop tools that looks into that data and tells you something simple, that you can then design a simple study from an epidemiology perspective and go out, address that problem. And then Brandon's idea is, what the problem is, then you set up an intervention study to change it.
So I think from the qualitative side, to add to Dr. Morgan's point, this data is out there. Qualitative researchers have done this data because there is a lot of granularity to it. So people have examined why these types of things happen, and there's not one answer, but the data is out there. The data we're going to talk about, trial enrollment, the data is out there, at least from the qualitative side. So I think we are in a position to start to try and address these issues if we as a community have an appetite for it.
Mm-hmm. And I agree. I appreciate Dr. Blue's point about let's try something and then move it forward. Like, for example, in our foundation, we've tried patient advocacy programs that haven't worked so great, but we started a new one and it's working now. So we created a special African-American chapter with just topics, 12 times during the year for this group. And we want it to be a trusted place where information can be gathered, and it's working. We had a very successful launch. So yeah, I agree. Try things on a small scale and then expand what you find that is working. Yeah, totally agree. So Dr. Marinak, you co-lead the PROMISE study, which is looking to screen 50,000 individuals with high risk, potentially reasons for progression. So that includes family members of myeloma patients and also all African Americans. So Who would you consider to be African American? Is it self-reported? Why focus on this population? What do you want participants to do? I'm a patient advocate on this study, so I share your study all the time, and I'm a huge, hopefully bullhorn for you. So what does someone do as well if they go through the study and they receive a positive diagnosis of MGUS? What support do you provide for them?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, so Promise is a nationwide initiative that's fully remote. So essentially anyone can go to our website, promisestudy.org, to sign up. And we're screening individuals at a high risk for developing myeloma to see if they have the precursor or pre-malignant conditions of monoclinical myopathy of undetermined significance, or MGUS, or smoldering myeloma, so that we can study these conditions and identify prevention strategies or ways to stop myeloma from developing in patients with this earliest precursor conditions. And it's based on the very simple idea that we screen for other common cancers, but we don't screen for multiple myeloma, and it's often diagnosed very late when patients show symptoms, and we want to try to change that. Now, you mentioned, we're specifically screening individuals who are between the ages of 40 and 75 and have a strong risk factor for multiple myeloma, such as being self-identifying as being Black or African American. And we're interested in these individuals because they seem to be at least twice as likely to develop multiple myeloma or its precursor conditions. And it's really important for us as a research program to ensure that we can recruit and enroll Black and African American individuals because, as we're discussing, they're disproportionately affected by myeloma and its precursor conditions, but they're often underrepresented in clinical research. And so we don't fully understand, why they're more likely to develop myeloma. We launched the screening study in 2019, so we're still fairly young. And to date, we've detected a multiple myeloma precursor condition in several hundred individuals. Now, everyone that is screened positive on our study, usually they're screening positive for its earliest precursor condition, MGUS. Now, everyone that is screened positive, we provide education and an experience that we're calling the white glove experience to ensure that they get the follow-up care they need, regardless of their geographic location or socioeconomic barriers. And so as part of this effort, we connect our positive patients with local experts who can help oversee their care. We help patients enroll in insurance coverage. We have an oncologist, hematologist, oncologist who will see patients remotely on a sliding scale basis for those that are uninsured or underinsured. And we even see some patients virtually at Dana-Farber as part of our blood cancer prevention program. And finally, to make sure that people are taking advantage of the resources that we're providing who are positive, we now provide a financial incentive. So essentially, we pay people to get the follow-up care that they need after we diagnose them with a precursor condition. And then, of course, we follow patients prospectively over time with these conditions, and we'll be providing opportunities for intervention, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And I would like to ask the panel, how do studies like these help with the diversity issue, Dr. Gormley, that you brought up, and other access issues or things like that? How do studies like these help with what we're trying to accomplish?
So here at Moffitt Cancer Center in Tampa, Florida, we also are being partners with the Promise program. And so for us, the main reason why we were excited about something like this is that we're uniquely situated in Florida. We have a large amount of African American and Hispanic population. And so for us, we need to help the people who are affected by this condition. Sometimes a lot of clinical trials are, testing, is drug A better than drug B? Or if we put A plus B together, some of those things are super important, and it definitely has made advances in the field. But really what we need to do is, how do we help the people who have it now, or who are the people who are at risk now? People always ask about, hey, I have this diagnosis. What about my son? What about my brother, my sister? And those are questions that really can impact people right now. And so I'm glad that we were able to do this. And so I'm happy to be a partner with that. And Catherine, we can talk more offline about it, but really this is something that hopefully can be a game changer.
Mhm. And others? These types of larger studies, do they lay the groundwork for other types of study that needs to happen for this population?
So when you look at, I guess, barriers to why patients don't go on study, there are certain themes that come up again and again. And what's nice about this is the design of this really gets towards some of those barriers, right? So what are the things that come up time and time again? Trust comes up time and time again. Cost and lack of access. Those are the big themes. So I think we talk a lot about why aren't the patients, well, again, we know. So these are things that are addressed. So cost, lack of access, super important things that have been addressed. So these are the types of strategies that we need to have to bring studies locally to people in the community, to engage continuously, not just. Greg used the phrase before in a conversation with me of parachuting in, and so this is not that. So this is a great way of addressing why people are not going on study.
And maybe in terms of clinical trial development, that access issue, because you don't have to go anywhere, you can just join from home, you can go to your local lab. I mean, maybe this is a new way of completely reinventing the clinical trial model.
Yeah, and we've noticed, so we have this online platform where we send people collection kits, ask them to go to a local lab. Should notice that we do see a drop off, particularly those who self-identify as Black or African American will sign up, but not go to a local lab due to barriers. It could be where they live, their lab is an hour away. What's unfortunate with COVID is, prior to some of the lockdown restrictions, we were doing community health events, working with trusted community health advisors, going to where people are and offering screening on site to minimize some of the barriers. So there's not give a kit, ask somebody to drive an hour away to do a screening. So I think the more that we can break down barriers with respect to cost, with respect to location, I think the more participation we're going to get, as well as working with trusted community health advocates, community health advisors, and key informants.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can't underestimate how important lack of access is. And lack of access is not just, is it local? Is it a system you're comfortable with? Is it close to people you trust? Do you have to get 3 buses to get there? Is it needing the internet that you don't have in your house? So lack of access can take many forms, and we really, I think, engaging people in the community and in their area of comfort is hugely, hugely important.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I think that includes education and bringing that to them as well. Because like I've even just going out to small towns in Arkansas and giving a talk for the community there, and how much they really embraced me coming out there to talk about myeloma and what I do and all the questions they had. And they were just people that were from the community college around there, not necessarily students, but just people and out and about. And they really appreciated me coming out there and talking to them directly and understanding why it's important for them to like ask if there are any clinical studies that they can be put on and stuff like that. So I think that's very important as well. So all that going to them. And
so this gets to an issue of trust, right? Because people don't do things in general that are going to harm themselves. There's always reasons why people make decisions, and there may be either historical or personal reasons. So I think continuing to always sometimes it takes years to break down that barrier, but it's about actually being there and not being there just, hey, for a trial. It's about being there to help people and continue that discussion after months and months, because it's not oftentimes we, I think, misinterpret things of, oh, it's a suspicion. This is not the case. It's you've got to engage people, and you have to earn trust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Patricia, I'm gonna just say this real quick. I think also the onus for building that trust needs to be on us as the healthcare team, though. A lot of time people say, oh, well, why don't they trust us? It's like, what reason have we given them to trust us? You read in the news about, people who are millionaires like Serena Williams going to the hospital to deliver a baby and almost dying, simple things. I mean, people have been making babies since the beginning of time, and, and money or stature and those kind of things really not, having an impact or really mattering. And so, certain populations of people who I think we really got to kind of wrap our arms around and just say, hey, we're here to help. And of course, people are going to look at us sideways the first time, right? Because that's an unfamiliar thing that's not happening in healthcare. And so I think it starts with the people on this panel. And I think if we can kind of do that and help people, then I think that's really what we need to do, and just let them know, it starts with, one person. And if you get one turns to two, two turns to four. And that's the way we change the world.
Yeah, I want to high five Dr. Blue. That's absolutely the thing, right? The onus is on us. The onus is on us. It's not on the patient at all. Totally, absolutely.
Yeah, great conversation. So next question. So opportunities that come with reducing and eliminating racial disparities in cancer research has led to initiation of many groundbreaking research ideas. So none more so than Dr. Morgan's idea to study how myeloma evolves in Black patients over time by using a new technology called mutagraphs. So Dr. Morgan, what are mutagraphs and how can they be used in the future?
So if you sequence the whole genome of people and you get 2 samples with a year between them, it allows you to look at how that disease is evolving. And so you can now identify mutagraphs or signatures of the immune response and how it's mediated by the environment. And so the idea is to collect 100 African American smoldering myelomas and 100 Caucasian Americans, and then to look at the signatures in each of those disease states. Then by looking at 2 samples, you can then calculate what happened early on in the disease natural history, because maybe we're looking too late. So there's one study that looked at sequence differences between African Americans and found, a few minimal differences. But really, if you want to look at how a disease starts, you have to look at the beginning of the process. So this is a cool new tool of being able to look at the beginning and then correlate that with the genetic makeup of that individual. So African Americans are not Africans, they're African Americans, and working out the exact content where in Africa they came from, the combination of African, European American, Native American, etc., allows you to really kind of tunnel down on the differences. And it's the differences which will allow us to understand what's the commonality of why do people get multiple myeloma and why is there more in the African American community. And it's not going to be a simple answer, but we need to have at least some theories of what's different between the two groups. And it is going to be about environment, people think myeloma is a disease of the elderly, right? And so I think that's perfectly reasonable, except when you calculate when myeloma arises, it's in your late teens and early 20s, when exposure to diet, viruses, infections in the environment can make a huge difference. And so really what I'm saying is we're going to take a classic epidemiology approach and build a registry of African Americans so that we can actually get samples from them and then use that to look at the early stages of the disease. And people have said that this morning, it's African Americans, 15% of the population. In any given study, it's less than 15% of people that are included. And to get that number of people, you have to start, you can't aim to just recruit generally because you'll never have enough to answer the question. So we're trying to go after specifically African Americans that have smoldering myeloma to try and bulk up the numbers so there's at least some chance that we can get a good idea of these early disease stages.
And you need sufficient numbers too, right? Because I mean, like all myeloma is not the same genomically. So you're having to segregate out these different patients. And so you need a decent amount.
Well,
to,
I mean, we've talked about it. Like
yeah.
15% of myeloma is an 11-14. So 15% of 15%, you're never going to know if there's a huge difference in the etiology of 11-14 myelomas unless you really focus on the African American community to recruit those patients.
Right, absolutely. Any other comments from our panel?
This is a little dicey, but I feel like I gotta say it, Gareth. I'm gonna just say this too. Just the only reason why I think that that's important information too. But one thing you'll find out too, and I'm sure you're already considering this, but African Americans is such a potpourri of different backgrounds. We use that as a blanket term, but many of us don't know where we came from. Many of us probably have a little bit of Native American in us, a little bit of us probably have some European in us, because of some of the things that was done to our ancestors. So who knows really what the background of majority, and then are you living in the north versus the south? I mean, here in Florida, I'm sure you might see some things in different, what they call the Mason distance lines, so I'm sure there were some things that have happened in the past that have changed really the way that things are happening right now. So I imagine your studies probably show some of those that we might be even more similar than we think, and so we might see a skin tone difference, but really if you look underneath the hood, the engine might all look the same. And so we'll see, but just know that I just had to say that.
So I think you're completely correct. And so that's why I'm excited about doing this study, because these scores called admixture scores will absolutely quantitate reliably kind of the complete genetic background for an individual. And so that's really exciting, because everybody is in the past just kind of really labeled people as African American, and there's a huge difference between the North and the South, like you say. And I think it's really worth trying to dig into that, not to label people, but to really understand if there are significant genetic differences, or whether it's simply socioeconomic, which has the potential to be, but nobody's really looked.
Yeah, interesting point. Yeah, so interesting. Okay, next question. The FDA and its Center for Drug Evaluation Research, known as CDER, is arguably the most important agency to patients of all diseases that few have ever heard about. Dr. Gormley, all myeloma drug approvals come through your office. So can you give us an idea of why it's important to have data on these different patient populations? You mentioned this a little bit earlier, but do you have any strategies to help include patients who might lack access to information, communication technology, maybe more dispersed clinical trials, more local trials? How do you work with institutions to drive innovative research, especially with respect to addressing these types of diversities?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There's a lot there. But I guess I'll start and just share a little bit and make sure we're all on the same plane. It's actually what we do at the FDA. So when we review drugs for approval at the FDA, and you capitalized this earlier in your question, I think it's really important. We're approving products for the American patient population, like all patients. And so, I think it's really important, if the information that we have from a clinical trial is limited in scope, then sometimes it can be hard and there can be uncertainties when we're thinking about, applying this then to a broader patient population. So specifically, industry sponsors, drug companies, they conduct clinical trials, and then they submit them to the FDA for review. And then we look through the data from that clinical trial. We review it for the activity, the efficacy of the product, and how well it treats the actual disease, myeloma in this case. We look at the safety profile of the product. What are the side effects that occur with it, et cetera. And then ultimately, decide whether or not it's a favorable risk-benefit profile such that the product should be approved, and then for what population it should be approved in. And our job is really challenging if we don't have the data from a diverse patient population. So just as an example, if you have a product that causes hypertension, But the clinical trial in which it was studied in is really a younger patient population or a more fit population, then we may think, oh, well, this drug actually doesn't cause hypertension that much, whereas if the trial had enrolled older patients or included a larger percentage of older patients or a larger percentage of minorities that have greater risk of hypertension, then we might have more data to say, oh, that risk is actually quite substantial and might make modifications, et cetera, based on that information. So it's really important, both for safety and efficacy, that we have diverse patient populations in the clinical trial data that we're reviewing. And so, getting to some of your other questions, we really encourage sponsors and those conducting clinical trials to enroll a diverse patient population very early on in development and to collect a lot of information on the pharmacokinetics, how the drug is handled by the body, metabolized, and the pharmacodynamic properties, efficacy, safety, and then apply that information that's gleaned early in development to continue throughout the whole drug development process. And there have been quite a few lessons learned during the coronavirus, in particular, as it relates to ways to improve bringing clinical trials to patients. And it's hope, that ultimately we can continue that after the pandemic. But, in terms of finding ways to simplify the online consent, conducting it remotely, telemedicine visits, or conducting visits at local sites rather than at a central location, a decentralized approach sort of to clinical trials. And we've been advocating for this at the FDA and working with sponsors as to what this looks like for individual trials. But it's hope that this and other sort of efforts can help bring clinical trials to a broader population, some of the topics we were talking about a little bit earlier. And especially like in rural areas or areas where there may be challenges for access and burdens associated with clinical trial participation. And then on the FDA side, we have various projects that are ongoing within the Oncology Center of Excellence that are specifically aimed at addressing disparities. This past February in 2020, our office specifically co-hosted a workshop with AACR that was specifically addressed at examining the underrepresentation of African Americans in multiple myeloma clinical trials. And this workshop put forth several recommendations, including broadening eligibility criteria, having diversity plans for each study, diversity officers that might oversee the clinical trial to ensure that those standards were being met, other aspects regarding representation in the clinical trial, and then pre-specified analyses that were based on various subpopulations as well. And so these recommendations were actually just published this past week in Blood Cancer Discovery. And we're really hoping that these sort of recommendations sort of serve as a call to action for sponsors and those conducting clinical trials to help address these disparities, specifically in multiple myeloma. But the principles apply broadly across all cancers and other therapeutic areas as well. And so this is an area that's really important for us at the FDA because as I mentioned earlier, we are approving products for the American patient population, and so we need to have data that informs how the product will work in all patients.
Yeah, that's such an important idea that you have to know that in order to approve things safely. So really important.
So Nicole, what's the official view on there's a lot of studies that were within the last 10 to 15 years that have been done in Eastern European, or they're based in Eastern Europe and in Asia. So they're clearly not representative of American either treatments or kind of genetic makeup. So is that going to be addressed in some way?
Yeah, so I think, this is actually, you bring up a good point, and this is something we struggle with in that clinical trials are conducted globally. And oftentimes, there's actually, separate and apart from just not very many African Americans, there's often not very much US representation. Yeah. And then we're looking at, not having enough data on Asians or Hispanic populations, Native American populations are almost non-existent, African Americans, et cetera. So, this is an issue that we struggle with. And, we in the office are really encouraging folks to make sure that we actually have this information. And it is a balancing act, right? Because, just because we don't have this information, we don't want to hold up drug development, obviously, and we want to get effective therapies out as quickly as possible. So, we're encouraging folks to get this information early in development, and if it can't be done before approval, then we're actually beginning to require or ask for, in some circumstances, this data afterwards. In some of our recent approvals, we've actually issued either post-marketing requirements or post-marketing commitments to collect this information after the drug has been approved on more diverse patient populations. So it is a balancing act, and it is something that our office is actively encouraging sponsors to provide this information as early as possible, because it informs. And I think, one of the tragedies of this whole situation is it actually has the potential to expedite drug development. I keep thinking back to the in different disease space. Everyone may not know the story, but the gefitinib example, where it was initially approved, and then the confirmatory trials really didn't show much activity, and so the product was actually withdrawn from the market. But some of the sub-studies and subpopulations that were evaluated in this trial showed that Asians responded a little bit better, and females responded better. And then as more studies were done, et cetera, it was recognized that those with the EGFR mutation responded better, and then it was ultimately approved for those patients with an EGFR mutation. But if we had perhaps maybe a more diverse patient population earlier or whatever, we could have learned a little bit more along the pathway and then figured out which patients would most benefit from certain therapies. So I think if we actually were able to enroll more diverse patient populations early on and get more information, we actually might expedite drug development. So we're encouraging sponsors, and that's sort of where things are right now.
Great.
Can I say something controversial, Dr. Gormley?
Sure.
Beyond encouragement, and I think the blood cancer discovery paper is extremely important, and it's as you say, a call to arms. But beyond encouragement, do you think things would move quicker if sponsors were mandated to include a certain number of minorities? Because I think that's something that may shift things very quickly, and I think they're the primary drivers of what's happening here. And so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So, and I have to, clarify a little bit. Our requirement is that there must be enough information to have confidence on the representativeness of the data to a U.S. patient population. That being said, we cannot actually require that there be specific numbers. If the community and groups such as Myeloma Crowd and other advocacy community groups come together and advocate to Congress that should be a requirement, then Congress could, give us the regulatory authority to require that. As it stands, we can't require it. We strongly advocate, and I think, as well, the community has a role to come together and sort of encourage sponsors as well, and industry to, and I've seen this as well, actually, and in multiple aspects, that actually industry really is interested in gathering this information, and they have been responsive to our suggestions and encouragement. And it is always a question of carrot stick, always, but I think there are opportunities that, as a community, we can come together and encourage or advocate, if need be, to Congress and other authorities to sort of get these questions and to really put this on the forefront as an issue.
Well, we have we had more questions lined up for you, but we really want to get to the audience questions as well, because we have a lot of them lined up. But before we do that, I just, in keeping with the theme of this entire program, and I'm starting with Dr. Patel, and if all of you might chime in briefly on what you think about this. Why should this issue be important to patients who aren't or who don't think they are impacted by disparities? Why should I care if I don't think I belong to a group of disparities about disparities issues? And we'll start with Dr. Patel, and then if all of you could just briefly give us your thoughts, and then we can go to the Q&A.
Thanks, Greg. I think a lot about this question, actually. I think you've heard a lot of smart people on this panel today make very strong arguments as to how everyone is affected by this, because the science will get towards everyone's myeloma. I think you heard that just now from Dr. Gormley, you heard that from Dr. Morgan. So you know that everyone is impacted by these issues, and investigating those issues will help everyone. Scientifically, it will. But ultimately, I always come back to this bleeding heart part that I just think it just doesn't make sense to me. Why aren't we fair? Why don't we have equity? We should all want that to be, we should all want it, you know? We should all want our fellow man to have the same access to it. So yeah, we can make it about self-interest, but ultimately, you know what? We should care about other people, and that's where I land.
Anyone else?
Yeah, well, you know, we all have some type of marginalized group, you know, if we get down to it. If you dissect it enough, if it's not race, then is it gender? You know, there's a disparity there. And if it's not that, you say, well, I'm left-handed, you know what I mean? There's a disparity there. You know, I grew up and I couldn't use scissors for a while when I was a kid, you know what I mean? So we all have some issue, or, you know, you know, at this point, there's a LGBTQ community, you know what I mean? There's so many ways outside of race that for sure people have some type of marginalized group that they either are a part of or that connects to them. And so I think that, you know, race is the one that we've kind of discussed today, but really there's many more. And so, you know, society likes to fit us all in a box, but like I said before, we're probably all more similar than we are different. But we just really just want to try to focus on, if we know that, hey, this person in this particular group is having a hard time, they actually may be a part of a sane group of us if we kind of, you know, take a step back and kind of really look at other things other than skin color. So that was my two thoughts.
So I'm going to follow up on Pritesh's point about the science. The more diversity, the better the basic science, the better the drug development. And you can make a very straightforward science argument for doing it. And so I think it's important we should do it.